booktube and the handful of new subscribers that have drifted my way. Welcome, I'm Heather, and this is my channel Recently Seen Reading. I haven't been seen reading much lately. It's been pretty much a summer of unseen reading, in my corner of the world at least, largely because the heat wave just took it out of me and because I went through a series of very much necessary medical tests. It took a long time to get things scheduled, results that weren't expected, rescheduling, waiting, some uncomfortable testing, and the result you always want when you're facing a medical situation that could, at the very least, change your life, if not end it. And all is well, all is well. But that made for a tough summer, tougher than I expected it to be summer. So my reading was largely very distracted, often of stuff intended to be distracted, you know, lighter feel, romances, mysteries, westerns, whatever caught or could keep my attention longer than 15 minutes. So I don't have a heck of a lot that's very polished to talk about, but there are a handful of the reading I did over the summer of books that have stuck in my memory for one reason or another. So maybe what I'll do today as part of getting back into recording is talk a little bit about a handful of books that have stuck with me. And not always for being brilliant books, often because they're books that I found slightly flawed, but flawed in ways that kept me coming back to thinking about them. So let's have a look at what I actually remember of the reading I did in the summer of too many medical tests. So the novel that has stuck with me the most, I suspect, is The Secret Agent, which was published in 1907 and written by Joseph Conrad. Now I read this, easily 40 years ago, and it was part of a survey course in modern British literature. And it went over my head, parts of it, just didn't understand it. It's the story of Adolf Verloc and his wife Winnie and her brother Stevie, who lives with them. And Verloc is a spy, he's a secret agent, not the title, and he's a provocateur. And he's surrounded himself with men who belong to various radical groups in England in the late 1890s, early 1900s. A time of a lot of anarchist political thinking. And much of what was going on in the novel and the conversations amongst the men and about the men made no sense to me at all. I had read very little radical political literature or even of the history of the period, so it just went over my head. Since then I've read quite a bit of stuff about and by communists and a little bit about anarchists, so that some of the push and pull in the conversations makes more sense to me now, so I'm glad I reread it. And I know that when I read this as a teenager, I didn't understand some of the opening chapters of the novel and the way in which the Verloc shop was being described. Much of that went over my head. The shop is described as being seedy in an upward section of London, and that I kind of understood, but I really didn't understand that part of the shop's attraction to its furtive customers was that it sold things like nude photographs of one assumes women, but potentially men as well, and sold things like French safes, prophylactics, rubbers. All of that just went right over my head when I was very young. So I am glad to have read it. It's kind of an interesting thing to reread after so many years, to see how much you missed and to notice how fine Conrad's writing is for a man who is writing in his second or third language in particular. And I don't think Conrad is much read these days, but The Secret Agent is a pretty good novel to start with if you wanted to read some Conrad. What else did I read? Colm Tóibín. I read Blackwater, Lightship, a novel he published in 1999, I think, and it's about the death of Declan. It's set in 1990s Ireland, and Declan is in the last stages of dying of HIV and AIDS. And so at that time, at the time of the novel, the early 90s, treatment for AIDS was devastatingly awful, ineffective, and awful, and the social stigma of having AIDS and dying of AIDS and being gay in, an intensely Catholic country was immensely difficult. So I went to the novel because I wanted to read about that period in time, and I wanted to read about what that experience was like for people living in Ireland at the time. And the story doesn't so much tell Declan's story, or at least not in the way I expected it to. It tells more the story of his sister, mother, and grandmother as they come together around Declan and Declan's chosen family, the men who love him and take care of him. And they are all at Declan's grandmother's home, which is, 1 or 2 steps away from falling into the ocean. And it's a story that's primarily focused on Declan's sister. Let me see, what's her name? Can I remember her name or find it? Helen, who is middle-aged, working as a teacher, negotiating all that means, so how to have a professional life, maintain and support your husband's professional life, and bring up kids and teach kids, and at the same time deal with all of the stuff that hasn't been dealt with in your childhood as your sibling is actively dying in front of you and being hopeless and helpless in the face of that. I think this is quite a good novel. It's not really a novel about Declan's experience dying. It's all told from the observer's point of view, the people observing him dying and his female relatives, and the way they struggle with him and with each other over terrible things that have happened in the past, and they're ordinary terrible things like financial struggles, estrangement within families, and the death of family members. So I'm very much happy that I read this novel, and I would recommend it, but don't come to it as I did, expecting it to be very much focused on Declan's experience. I think it's quite a good novel, probably not a perfect novel, but quite a good novel. What else did I read in novels? Tell Me How Long the Train Has Been Gone by James Baldwin. This was published in the late 1968, and it's the story of Leo Proudhammer, who has a heart attack on stage. This is in the first 2 or 3 pages of the novel, not a spoiler. And it's his memories of growing up as he recovers from the heart attack. He's thinking about his childhood and adolescence and adulthood, and his struggle to become an actor and to be employed in a way that respects his talents and skills and doesn't obsess about his skin color. It's very much a James Baldwin novel. A lot of the themes that you'd find in Another Country, and maybe a little bit of what's in Giovanni's Room and some of the essays, are echoed in this novel, Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone. And it's Baldwin's working through what it means to be an artist when your talent is constrained, so tightly constrained by the racism of the people around you. I don't think this is his strongest novel. I think it's probably underread. It's definitely on my list of books to reread in the future, to get a better handle on what the book is doing structurally. There is some stuff in it that's a little off-putting, especially when he's in the sections about his youth and he's talking about his father. His father's a very hardcore anti-Semite, and that can be unpleasant to read through. That diminishes, or that aspect of the family's position in Harlem diminishes as you get farther along in the book, but it is an unpleasant aspect of the main character's childhood. So I think I just have one more Baldwin novel to read, and a clutch of short stories volumes, which I probably won't get to this year, but I'm nearly finished reading all of the novels. I think if you are interested in mid-century novels, so stuff written between 1950 and 1970, you'd enjoy this novel, especially if you're interested in what it was like to be talented and black and thwarted. I think it's a very good novel to read about that. So those are the three novels that have stayed with me from that patch of reading over the summer. And then there are two nonfiction and one collection of short stories that have stuck with me. The first is a memoir by Bernardine, Evaristo. Came out last year, 2021. That was last year? Yeah, 2021. Manifesto. And this is essentially her memoir, divided up essentially chronologically. And I found this quite a frustrating book to read. The title made me think I was going to get something far more overtly politically engaged, and it didn't read that way for me. It's smoothly written. It covers the full range of her life. It does have lots of political content. It covers, in an interesting way, difficult childhood. In particular, it comes up to and brushes against, but doesn't really explore very deeply, Evaristo's relationship with her father, who was Nigerian, and often very angry, from what you can glimpse in the memoir, occasionally violent at home and in the workplace, and unhappy. He seems to have spent a lot of his time working very, very hard and also being a very unhappy person. And it traces her childhood, her time in school, her time running an independent theater company, a long section on her relationship with women when she was identifying as a lesbian, one happy relationship, one very unhappy relationship when she was caught up for nearly a decade, it seems, with an abusive woman. Echoes of Carmen Machado. If you found that part of Machado's memoir interesting, you might find this part of Evaristo interesting. And then on in Evaristo's account to her movement back to having relationships and marrying men. So kind of a standard arc of her story. It does talk about her writing process, and that's probably one of the most interesting things for me in this book, is the way she describes how she wrote all of the various books she's written. And many of them began as one genre and then through the rewriting process became something else. So something that would have started out as prose would be written as prose, then she'd come back to finish the revisions and look at it and decide, this isn't working, why isn't this working? And then recast it all into poetry. And I think that might be at the core of what I found frustrating about Manifesto. The writing struck me as quite flat in places, just something off in it. And I wonder if it's something that she rushed through the publication process to take advantage, as writers should, of the positive press that came from her Booker win. I'd be really curious to see what Evaristo does with the memoir content in 5 or 6 years, when she has worked through more of the stuff that you need to work through when you're writing a memoir, and when she's figured out how to tackle it as a genre. I don't think she's quite got the successful handle on genre, on how to tell the kind of memoir she's trying to tell. A memoir that is both reveals and grapples with the stuff she doesn't know. I don't think she's quite there with Manifesto, but if you're curious about her composition process and how she writes and how she rewrites and the impact of that on her finished product, you might find this interesting. But if you're looking for very fine prose, you might be disappointed. Okay, what else did I read that stuck in my memory? Non-fiction collection by Robyn, Maynard and Leanne Betasamosake, Simpson, Rehearsals for a Living, and this is billed as a collection of letters between Maynard and Simpson, covering the first year and a bit of the pandemic. And as a collection of letters back and forth, it explores and articulates and explains their very different experiences as writers, as parents, and as people who are in different ways, very different ways, dispossessed of a land base. It offers a way, I think, of entering into a politically complex and often fraught discussion between Black Canadians and Indigenous Canadians, and that relationship is not always smooth. I think any Black Indigenous person could tell you about the difficulties of that relationship. And on the one hand, this is a very informative, educational book to read. It's clear that Maynard in particular is grappling with what this relationship is, how to form a positive, effective relationship between Indigenous and Black communities. And for that, it's a valuable book to read. And if you've read a little bit either about the impact of policing on Black lives in Canada, Maynard has written one of the best books on that subject, or if you're interested in Indigenous land back efforts in a very kind of slant way, the Simpsons sections might be interesting. But I think for me, it's a very uneven book, and I found parts of it quite frustrating, and some of this is a personal quirk of mine. Some of the prose, especially in the first third of the book, some of the sentences grammatically fall apart in multiple times and in multiple different ways, and they just grammatically fall apart and never resolve into either a stepping away from formal grammar because we're writing letters casually to friends, or we're talking, and anyone who's watched a booktube video or edited a booktube video is painfully aware that none of us speak in grammatically complete or correct sentences. But these sentences in Rehearsals for a Living don't resolve in that way, and they don't resolve into a particular style either. It doesn't seem to be a stylistic statement or effort. They just seem to have grammatically have fallen apart and not been caught by the editorial process. So this, I think, is coming out of how close some of this material is to being redigested academic material. And most academic material is written in complete sentences and all of that, but maybe something in the process of reworking that for a letter or for a general audience has complicated the writing, or maybe it came to press too soon. Maybe the desire to have it published when it's still fresh, when people still freshly and painfully remembered that first year of the pandemic, maybe that drained away a little bit of the editorial attention it needed. I'm the kind of reader who gets potentially overly distracted by that kind of problem in a book when I notice that there is something very wrong with the way the book has been edited, essentially. I find it difficult to get back into the book, and I find it difficult to pay it the kind of attention that work often deserves. I'm that way, but you don't have to be. And I think this book has lots to offer. I think it's got lots of complicated ideas that Maynard in particular is trying to explain. Struggles, I think, in explaining. There's lots here, I think, of value, especially if you come to it with a little bit of foreknowledge of the topics. I think you'll find it a much richer reading experience. But if you come to it expecting letters, real conversational letters, the kind of letters that are very personal, say like Ivan Coyote's recent collection, Care Of. It's a collection of letters that Coyote wrote to their fans and people who had sent them letters over the course of a long career. And Coyote sat down during the pandemic and used that time to respond to these letters. And those in tone are very different. First of all, there's no responding voice. It makes it a very different kind of project. But also, they're much more casual. And the voice comes through that is far closer to, say, Coyote's performance voice. And it makes it more successful, I think, as a collection of letters, or at least a very different kind of collection of letters. These are very academic letters being exchanged between one very academic person and one less academic person. And as a result, I think the collection suffers a little bit. So don't go into it expecting personal letters back and forth. They're a different kind of letter. And the last book that stuck with me and I thought a lot about and haven't come to a final position on is Chelsea Vowel's new collection of short stories, her first published collection of short stories. Buffalo is the New Buffalo. and these are all, they're not all futuristic, but they're all stories that take place in a landscape and a time in which Métis cosmologies and ways of thinking and ways of doing create new futures, new ways of thinking about the past, new ways of imagining the future. And those stories, for the most part, are quite successful. They really are finely written. They help you think about the world and the relationships between people and plants and people and animals in different ways. And I think that's an immensely important thing to put into the world. And the futuristic aspects are great. Vowel runs a podcast as well. I think it's called Métis in Space, which, as you'd expect, takes a Métis lens or point of view to standard science fiction patterns and tropes and kind of tears a strip off of them. Especially the way that Indigenous peoples are represented in science fiction, which is pretty hilarious. What I struggled with in this book was how close it is, I think, still to her MFA submission. She wrote these stories as part of completing her MFA, and it's not anything about the stories themselves. She includes footnotes that are, I think, actually quite helpful to most readers, especially most non-Métis readers. So she puts in footnotes to explain concepts or to counter misperceptions of Métis culture and cosmology and ways of thinking that she undoubtedly has encountered in settlers and white people and black people in the world. So they're helpful aids to the reader, and I think the footnotes are more successful than the other thing that to me signals that it's still maybe a little too close to being an academic work. And those are small essays that follow each of the short stories, which explain sometimes the theme of the story, how it came about, the composition process, the gaps in a white reader's understanding. And I struggled with those. I found that they interrupted kind of the reading flow for me, but I think they're probably a valuable addition. I think I would like to have seen her have more time away from them so that you could digest them a bit more, but I think what she's trying to do is create the reader she needs. She is, in these little essays, she is trying to teach white readers like me, how to read Métis literature, how to read Métis short stories. What she's trying to do, and what actually makes these little essays that I found off-putting valuable, is that she is clearly trying to teach an audience how to read her work and how to read it appropriately, how not to take big missteps in reading and interpreting what she's imagining and the kind of alternative futures she's imagining. And that, I think, is valuable. I think it's a little off-putting in the way it's done, but the content and the goal, educating your reader to be a better reader, because you want to communicate and you want to communicate something that's important, is a good thing. So I have an uneven, mixed reaction to the collection as a whole, but I would recommend reading it. It's a great reading experience, the short stories themselves. And you might be the kind of reader that loves the footnotes and loves the discussion of the stories. You may find that it does what it's intended to do, enriches your reading experience, and that would be a great thing. So on the whole, strong collection, parts of it just not for me, and that's okay. So those are the 6 books I read over the course of the summer, of the ones that I remember or that I think are worth talking about after a summer that was unexpectedly difficult. So if you made it this far, thank you. I appreciate and welcome your attention, and I wish you a lot of good reading in September when the season turns and we're not struggling, in the north at least, with as much intense heat. Take care. Bye-bye.